Hi there. Today I want to talk about interpreter insurance. Now, even though it's not a legal obligation under UK law to have insurance if you're working as an interpreter, you'll often find that clients, industry regulators, language service providers or interpreting agencies, membership bodies, etc. may require you to have it in order to work with them. Not only that, but generally if you're running your own small business, either as a freelancer or otherwise, then it's always a good idea to have insurance to cover yourself for if things go wrong. Just like any other type of insurance, car insurance, home insurance, they're there in place just in case the worst happens, something that you'll hope you'll never ever need to use, but if you do, you'll be grateful for it. So why would an interpreter require insurance? Well, interpreters, if you think about it, are hired by individuals, first of all, corporations, so if you're doing some business interpreting, agencies, so as I mentioned before, language service providers or interpreting agencies, public services as well, so even if it's not directly, places like hospitals, courts, job centres, etc. Government entities, so you might work directly for the government as well, or in any of these. I mean, there's a bit of crossover between government entities and public services anyway, depending on which way you look at it. So there's all these different people that can hire you. And with all those different people, there are, of course, risks involved. Now, the biggest risks to interpreters is making an error that results in damages. And those damages could either damage the interpreting agency that you're working with, the client themselves, or even individuals. In a lot of cases, when you're interpreting between a professional and an individual, just a member of the public. And ultimately, if you do make an error, even though I'm sure you try not to, it could have an impact on them. So there's quite a few different commercial insurance providers or business insurance providers, and there's actually those out there that cater specifically for interpreters as well. So if you're looking for insurance, my advice would be to look for the ones that specifically set themselves up to look after the interests of interpreters. If they've got a bit more specialism, it's more likely you'll get the right kind of cover. Now, cover itself, it can start from as little as £7 a month, so it's not something that has to be really expensive. Obviously, working as a freelancer, you've got to watch your costs anyway, so you don't want to necessarily be paying a fortune for it. But of course, the amount you pay per month can depend on the level of cover you're getting. And again, my advice would be, in case the worst happens, it's great to have insurance in place, so make sure that you have something that is sufficient to cover what you need. So different types of insurance then. It is quite a confusing landscape. I myself am certainly not an insurance expert, so I would recommend that you double check all of this information anyway, but I'm trying to give you an idea from my point of view of the different types out there and what's useful for interpreters. I mean, at the end of the day as well, it varies depending on the actual provider. So it's always best to check with them what exactly you get. And certainly if they've got a number you can call them on, it might be worthwhile just exploring it with them. When I got my own business insurance, I think it was end of last year, I actually spoke to someone there, and they were able to advise me. They asked me what kind of things I required, and they were able to advise me what kind of cover they thought was best for me. So the different types of insurance out there that may or may not be relevant to yourself: public liability insurance, professional indemnity insurance, and business contents insurance. And we're just going to look at each of those in turn now. So the first of those that we're going to look at is public liability insurance. So public liability insurance is one that you may or may not want to take out to cover you for interpreting work. So it's generally good for working at client sites. So this is something that certainly a lot of interpreters do when they're face-to-face interpreting. They will go out and about and they will interpret at client sites, but certainly not every single interpreter will work at a client site. So if you never work on the site, then it's probably not for yourself. And it generally protects against personal injury or property damage that you might cause when you're at that client site. Now, again, if you're thinking about the role of an interpreter and what can happen there, it's not like you're on a building site or something like that, or doing work to the property itself that could relate or result, in personal injury or property damage. Generally, you'll be going in, you'll be sitting in a room in a sort of office environment almost, and you'll be providing an interpreting service. So it might be one that you want to consider. Again, talk to your insurance provider to make that decision, because most of the time I wouldn't thought that an interpreter would cause any personal injury or property damage when you're actually providing your services. However, it is out there. It's good to know about it. Now, generally, if you take out public liability insurance, it will cover you to a minimum of £1 million, and that's in damages and costs that you might have to pay out. You can get higher levels of insurance as well. And actually, if you are getting this kind of, any kind of insurance for interpreters based on working with a particular client, they themselves might have requirements for you. So it's always worth checking with them to find out if there is actually a requirement, and certainly in terms of the amount of cover that they ask for. So for example, if you are working with a language service provider, and regardless of what your role is, they do insist on public liability insurance, and let's say they say you need to be covered for a minimum of 5 million, then that's obviously what you need to do to be able to work with them and to cover yourself. Okay, so this one is probably more applicable to the majority of interpreters out there. It's professional indemnity insurance. And professional indemnity insurance is good for if you give advice, so that can certainly relate to interpreting, because you're not really giving advice, but you're certainly relating or interpreting that advice between people. Providing a professional service is also good for professional indemnity insurance, and of course that's exactly what interpreters do. You provide a professional service to your clients. And the handling of sensitive data. So again, as an interpreter, you are party to some quite sensitive data in different situations. Imagine yourself in a hospital doing the interpreting session there. There's going to be some confidential information passing between the doctor and the patient, and it's similar for a lot of corporate work or public service work. So that definitely applies to interpreters. So what does it cover? Well, professional indemnity insurance is for situations where a client loses money due to negligence. And by negligence, that's generally a failure to take proper care over something. So, for example, being careless. And it's a situation that can happen to interpreters. Interpreting is quite a tiring role. You're having to concentrate really hard for a long period of time. And obviously you're thinking as well. So you're not just listening to the conversation, but for example, if a doctor's speaking, you're also thinking about, how are you going to interpret that into another language? And it's possible while you're thinking about something like that, that you might miss something that's just being said. So it is quite easy for an interpreter, even a really experienced interpreter, to miss something and therefore make an error. So generally, this kind of insurance will protect you if you make a mistake in your work or provide bad advice. And again, you're not actually giving the advice, but let's say you interpret it incorrectly and it turns out to be the wrong advice. Again, think of a medical situation where you might misinterpret a dosage on medication or a treatment plan. Then it can easily, depending on what the nature of that is, it can turn into something that could be harmful to the patient and even to the hospital itself. If you share confidential or sensitive information without consent, it also protects you against that. Now, under the Interpreter Code of Conduct, you should never share confidential information, and I'm sure most of you don't, but it's always, again, good to keep in mind, just in case by accident you do that. And also, if you make a false statement that damages a person or a company's reputation. So that might apply in the example I gave earlier. It's maybe not just yourself that would be held liable for the advice that you give or the advice that you interpret, but it could also be the company or the doctor themselves. So this one I would definitely recommend for all interpreters. Now, normally the cover ranges from between £50,000 and £5 million. Again, if you're working for an agency or a particular client and they have a requirement, it's always good to check with them for exactly what you need in terms of cover. The third one that we had there was business contents insurance. Now, again, you might wonder how this relates to interpreting, but business contents insurance is good for if you work from home particularly. So if you're a video remote interpreter or a telephone interpreter who generally just works from home, doesn't actually go out and visit clients, then you might want to insure your business contents. Essentially, it protects your business equipment and furnishings. So, for example, if you use a laptop at home, if you're doing telephone interpreting, you might have a landline, you might have some expensive telephony equipment. The headsets aren't cheap that you can buy. They might be about £100 or more. As I mentioned, the laptop itself, if you're doing video remote interpreting, or even if you're keeping your work records on there, might have webcam equipment, you might have sound equipment. So actually, think about the situation. If suddenly it was all gone, would you be able to afford to replace it? How much of an inconvenience would it cause you? And would you be able to continue working without it? Or is there a possibility that you'd have a bit of a break in your working as well? So these are all reasons why you might want to consider business contents insurance. Generally, and again, it depends on the actual policy that you go for, but it should cover damaged or stolen equipment, lost equipment. So if you are out and about providing face-to-face interpreting, maybe you've got a laptop with some glossaries that you take with you, or diaries, or even your mobile phone. Smartphones can be expensive these days. So again, could it cover that lost equipment if you lose it when out and about? Natural events as well, such as fire or flood. So hope it doesn't happen to your property, but obviously these things do happen. So all of that would be covered by business contents insurance. And depending on how much the value is of your contents, then it can range from a few hundred to thousands of pounds, depending on what you need. So one final word about insurance. I just want to talk briefly about tax. Now, a lot of interpreters, of course, are freelance or sole traders. So you're watching the pennies all the time, and you'll probably be doing your own accounts, or you'll be getting someone like an accountant to do that for you. Now, the good news about insurance is that businesses can deduct what's known as allowable expenses. And business insurance is classed as an allowable expense. So what that should mean is you can deduct the cost of professional indemnity insurance or the other insurances we've mentioned when you're calculating your taxable profit. And as long as this is good advice for any kind of tax anyway, for any kind of sole trader, always keep a record of income and expenses for the tax office. And again, I'm not an accountant myself, so do check that with your accountant if you use one, or double check that information, but you should be able to put that down as an allowable expense, which means you can be covered. You've got that peace of mind. You've got what the clients need for you, but also it's not a massive expense for yourself personally. Thank you very much.